Welcome to the program. Bradley Sherman is back, and he's back by popular demand. One of our most downloaded episodes in Season 1 was the Episode 8 interview where Bradley joined us for a primer, what I think of, on demographic trends in the United States and around the world, and his unique take and perspective on that, as well as how he talks about it as he's advising companies, governments, public entities, people all over the world, quite frankly, about the shifting demographic realities of our world and what it means for businesses, individuals, and communities. For those who didn't get a chance to listen, I strongly encourage you to go back to episode 8. You can find it on my website, brianjmatos.com. And if you are a subscriber to this podcast series, just go back in your feed. Episode 8 was the first time that Bradley joined us. Now, you don't have to listen to that episode to listen to this one. It's not a part 1, part 2 kind of thing. It's a totally different set of conversation. So feel free to listen to this episode, and then when you're done, if you liked what you hear, and I hope you will, go back, Season 1, Episode 8. Bradley joined us for the first time, and there's tons of nuggets of information that are still salient today. For those, who, however, who did not catch Episode 8, Bradley is a demographic futurist, and he is an expert on all things dealing with the business of longevity, living longer, healthier lives. He's the founder of the Super Age, a global strategic advisory firm. He advises organizations, governments, businesses around the world on all elements of our changing demographic realities. He is a author of The Super Age, Decoding Our Demographic Destiny, published by HarperCollins, a book that you can get anywhere you get your books. We have a link to it in our show description and our show notes as well. And he is an expert on the mega trends of shifting demographics and how that impacts everything from our birth rates to our increasing economic mobility, as well as the collision of all of these mega trends in the world of business, in the world of nonprofits, and even down to our individual lives and our families. He is an expert, I think, on articulating these points of view. He's very well spoken. And the reason we wanted to bring him back now, and the reason many of you asked us to bring him back now, was because it's an election year in the United States, but it's an election year around much of the world. And it's fascinating how the demographic trends are affecting people's thought process as they consider who they're going to vote for and what issues matter to them in the forthcoming election. So I thought it was important that we pull up about a year after our first conversation with Bradley. Let's see what things have changed. Let's talk about some of those topics that are probably going to come up as we look at the political landscape and the voting public around the world. And let's specifically talk about how people are perceiving the economy, how age affects the electorate, and how political candidates reach different groups of people. Let's talk about generational shifts and what that means for the political alignment around the world. Let's talk about other elements of demographics like the urban-rural divide, how where you live impacts what you care about and what you think about when you're voting, how ethnic and racial divides are playing out in our politics today. We also discuss age inclusivity in the workplace. We talk about media consumption habits between younger and older generations. And we talk about adapting to this new environment, whether you are somebody in the business community, the nonprofit community, the political community, the policy community. We also spend a little bit of time peering into the future at some of those trends that Bradley's keeping an eye on that all of us should be aware of as well. So Bradley was generous with his time in episode 8. He's generous with his time here in season 2. I hope you enjoy this program, and stick around because at the end, I'm going to give a little bit of a personal take after this interview with Bradley on one element of the demographic realities that we're facing today that I think is particularly important for us to watch and to monitor in the year and maybe the years to come. So stick around to the end of the episode for that. But in the meantime, it is my honor to represent to you for his second go on our show, the leader of the Super Age movement and a global strategic advisor to many, Bradley Sherman. Bradley, welcome back to the program.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Yeah, backed by popular demand, one of our most downloaded podcast episodes, as well as one of our most viewed video clips on YouTube. So, thank you for taking the time to join us. It's timely, we feel like, here as we're recording in February of 2024, here in the United States and around much of the world. It's an election year for so many. And as always, we're starting to break down the dynamics of who's running and what are the issues going to be. But we always talk about the demographics, the classic breakdown of the electorate. Who cares about what? Who might be voting for whom? Is this going to break down gender lines, down urban rural lines? How should we be thinking about it? So, at the very high level, we'll start here in the United States. What are some of those demographic implications that you're looking for as we begin to get a picture of what our national election will look like in November?
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost, we can't get away from the president or his likely opponent's age. Those have just become central to the campaign. I think mostly for the worse. They don't do a real good service for our population or for the people who are serving us. Biden's in his 80s now. Trump's about 4 years behind him. And if they both are in the general election, they're running up against a country, an electorate that doesn't want old men necessarily running the country. About 75% of the US, three quarters of the population, believes we should have age limits now on how many years people can be alive to serve. Kind of nuts. But that's a big driver in how people are perceiving this election this year. Issues wise, we really are divided now. At least that's the way it feels. I think the recent inability for the Congress to pass a comprehensive immigration bill is something that most people kind of feel like we should be doing at this point, says it all. But I think that there's two issues that are really going to define the campaign this year. The first is the economy. And it's not the economy's performance because the economy is performing incredibly well. In fact, I would say it's overperforming. It's the perception of the economy. And people are perceiving that they're in a bad economy right now, even though they've seen their salaries go up against inflation. And here's why: there is a huge gap in the daily spend for people and what the actual inflationary prices were. So, grocery store prices, for example, they're through the roof. They're absolutely through the roof right now. It's almost embarrassing the kind of gouging that's happening in major supermarket chains across the country. And, if I was running a Republican campaign right now, or I was running against the incumbent, let's say that because it could go either way, that's the only advertisement I'd run right now. I'd run the cost of milk in 2020 and I'd run, or 2016 rather, and I'd run the cost of milk today, 2020 and today. And I think that alone is going to move people in a direction, one direction or not. And the other issue, abortion, it's not going away. It's not just a wedge issue anymore. It's a unifying issue. And I think that the Democrats are going to lean into this pretty hard. And just today, this is Friday, February 16th, when we're talking, it's been reported by the Times that President Trump is backing a 16-week national abortion ban. That's not going to help them. That's not going to help the Republican Party in the election at all. Because the vast majority of Americans do actually support women's health and women's reproductive health and are against these draconian bans. So it's not a good play for them long term.
Now, it's been fascinating listening to the media cover the current. We're in a primary process at this point, but it's pretty apparent who the candidates are going to be. Age has been a constant issue in that. It's been fascinating, though, to see other candidates have run in both parties. Now, current President Biden doesn't really have any serious competition in his primary. Former President Trump certainly did. They have been younger. Biden certainly ran against a series of younger candidates when he was running for the primary 4 years ago. They didn't make any traction. So, on the one hand, we hear a frustration with the elder generation running, and yet when the electorate has a chance to vote, it's not close. What should we make of what this actually means? What is the electorate telling us that we're missing in the mainstream conversation?
Well, we miss history. That's one of the big things we always miss because, in 1984, when Reagan was running, I guess it would have been 83 when this happened, the national polls all said the same thing. We don't want an old man like Reagan running for office. And this was a majority of both parties. It wasn't just the Democrats who were saying this, as Republicans too. And, the election rolls around and Reagan carries 49 out of 50 states. I don't think people actually have an issue with age in the voting booth, but I think it is something that they're comfortable saying that is a problem for them now. I also think since Reagan, we've had some underlying issues with the transparency of elected officials and their health status. And I think that's caused some trust issues amongst the population. And when you can see the outward signs of aging, whether it's Biden's shuffling walk or both Biden and Trump stumbling over their words or having a moment of forgetfulness, we start to think, well, wait a second, is there something else there that we're not being made aware of? And that's, Reagan's dementia diagnosis being tucked away, Trump's COVID diagnosis being tucked away, Senator Dianne Feinstein's multiple health issues being kind of swept under the rug. We still don't know what happened to Mitch McConnell multiple times. So I think that for the population at large, they see this and they say, okay, they're old, they might be in decline. No one's giving us an answer, and all these other people have hidden things from us in the past. Should we trust them at their word? But at the end of the day, people are going to get into the booth in November and they're going to say, these are my choices. I've got this person and that person. Which one is going to better serve me and the country? And it won't matter what their age is at that point.
Do you think that some of the rhetoric about seniors and the fact that President Biden, former President Trump are both being portrayed as people past their prime, shouldn't be running. Do you think, but knowing that a lot of elders do vote, it's probably the most reliable demographic of voters in the US at least.
Sure
Do you
is.
think that this might be having the opposite effect, that they're saying, wait, they're talking about me?
No, I actually don't. I think there might be an ounce of that, but I think that certainly of the older adults that I've spoken to, and this is anecdotal, conversational research, they all think the two candidates are too old, and these are men and
Interesting.
women in their 70s, 80s, and north. They look at them, the two of them, and say, and I've heard this. It's kind of a common theme here in these conversations. Is well, I'm not equipped to run for president
Mm.
at
Hmm.
75 or 85. Well, what's to say these men aren't equipped? I mean, Biden's got a pretty good track record in his 4 years of office. Some would say both Biden and Trump have been transformational in their leadership, for better or for worse. So I put the question back on folks to say, like, what is a leader supposed to do if not be transformational, if not lead? And why is their age such a underlying problem, at least in your psyche, at least in your imagination, to what they're able to accomplish? I mean, both the past two presidents have really shaken things up. And I would say have done more change than the younger presidents that preceded them, Clinton, Obama in particular.
So, one thing that surprised people in 2016 when President Trump won that election, in a real shock to a lot of people, maybe not to those who follow closely day to day the
And
polling, but I think
certainly not to me.
so one of the things that happened in that election, and I would argue it has happened several times in the past when there have been wave elections, is the electorate fundamentally changed. There was a new group of people, whether because they aged into voting age or because people who typically sat on the sideline got off the sideline and actively participated, maybe for the first time in their life or for the first time in a long time. Is there anything in the electorate in the United States today that you see of either people coming in off the sidelines, maybe stepping out of the electoral political scene, new generation coming in? Is there something in who's going to vote in November that we should be paying attention to that could just change the whole conversation of this election?
Well, the past three cycles, we've seen incredible voter participation rates amongst younger people, through the roof. Uh, Still not probably at what they should be, but they are through the roof against historic norms. Young people are obsessively progressive. At least two-thirds of both millennials and Gen Z consider themselves to be liberals and or progressives. On the upper end, it's about a third and a third and a third of older adults, those being 65 and above, the boomers. About a third of them are considered to be conservative, a third of them are considered to be independent, and a third are considered to be liberal or left leaning. And I would say of those independents, they probably lean a bit more conservative than liberal, but I digress. This is a numbers game now. So, yes, older voters do tend to vote at a higher rate than younger voters, but every year we lose about 2 million older voters. They exit, they expire, they're no longer here because they've died. At the same time, we're gaining about 2 million Gen Z voters or eligible Gen Z voters. So what we're seeing is a generational shift that's happening in political alignment right now. People have always said, if you're young, you're liberal. If you're old, you're more conservative. But right now, we're not seeing big moves into conservatism amongst Gen X and millennials. So that may not hold true for the future. I think for this election, we're also going to see an even greater, perhaps more stark divide between urban and rural counties, urban and rural states. As you know from my work, urban areas, the big states, remain relatively young, so they've gone bluer over time. In the more rural or Rust Belt states, some of the southern states, they've gone more red. Well, why is that? Well, they've gotten a lot older and they've remained somewhat monocultural. So these are the folks that actively support abortion bans. They tend to be more pro-religion. They tend to be more pro-gun. Um, and on a national election, this is where things get a little goopy, if I can use that word, goopy. They have an outsized voice now in the national elections. So I think that even in this race for president, Biden could lose by up to, I think it's about 2 to 3 million, win by 2 to 3 million votes and still lose the presidency. Much like Hillary, much like Gore. He could win the popular vote but lose the election because of the Electoral College. That's entirely possible. So, are people coming off the sidelines? I think women will continue to play a decisive role in the election. I think it's fairly common belief at this point that suburban moms are the ones that really are making these um, big choices for us at the end of the day, outside of Philadelphia, Pittsburgh in particular. They're the ones that are going to decide this for us this year.
Now, what's also interesting is when you get a new generation of voters who get to vote for the first time, or maybe they've been eligible, but this is the first time they're going to vote. It's a little bit of a mystery exactly what they're going to vote on. There are a few issues you can potentially narrow it down to. But let's take international affairs, which a few years ago on people's radar, but wasn't necessarily what people were voting on. We now have active conflicts in Eastern Europe. We have a tremendous tragedy in the Middle East on all sides of that conflict. And you have voters coming of age, coming of voting age in this seemingly chaotic world, trying to make sense of it. And it's fair to say that the older generation, we'll pick on the Democrats here for a moment in the US. They have a more traditional view of foreign policy and American intervention and who our allies are and what we do. And they're sort of following what I would say is a conventional playbook. And a younger generation that wants to rethink that and rethink America's relationships and how we intervene or don't intervene and who we support and who we don't support and how we support it. It feels like the current president has struggled with this, that he has a 50, 60-year experience of how to deal with international affairs, but he has a very vocal, passionate base of his party that doesn't necessarily agree, and in some cases has suggested that they're not going to support him for reelection based on his views. So this is a true it feels like a true generational divide moment in a big diverse political party where it's going to be hard to find that common ground. I'm curious what you think. How will that settle out? are these issues so outsized for the new generation that they may be willing to overlook all the other things they may agree with their party on, but there are lines that they're not willing to cross, and for that reason, they may either sit out the election or simply it's hard to believe they'd vote for the other side,
They're
but
not going to
sitting
vote
out
for.
is the
They're not going.
equivalent of.
They're not going to vote for the other side. I can tell you that right now. The bigger fear is that they're going to sit out, and the question is, what's the risk assessment on that right now? You hear, especially in a tight state like Michigan that has a very large Arab population, that seemingly this group of people says, we're not going to vote for you, Biden. We're either going to sit this out or vote for Trump. Well, they're not going to vote for Trump. That's just not going to happen. It's kind of like cockamamie to even think that that's possible, because that would be voting against their own self-interest in a major way, not a simple way, a major way. Sitting out is, I suppose, some kind of silly passive resistance, but I don't think that that's going to really manifest itself by November. We're still ways away from the election. There's a lot that can happen in these next few months, and people's attitudes will change in time. Now, younger people. What's interesting about younger people is that, and really about the electorate at large, is that we're having a populist moment right now in this country. A populist moment that we really haven't seen at this level since like 1930s, where populism has become kind of central. And this whole thing about America first, MAGAism, well, that's not too dissimilar from what younger people are thinking too. It's just they're looking at it through a different lens. So younger people are concerned about America's position in the world. They're concerned that we're bullies. Young people don't like bullies, and they're actively fighting against that. But they're also raising a lot of very obvious questions. And from a populist standpoint, you have to listen to them. They're saying, we have all this money to fight all these wars, but we can't provide universal health care. We have all this money to fight all these wars and protect all these countries and American hegemonic power, but we can't give universal education. Like, we have all this money to fight all these wars and fight and intervene in all these conflicts, but I can't buy a house. Like, these are bread and butter kitchen table issues that have manifested now into a real populist movement. But what's interesting about the populist movement is that it's on both sides. There's populism on the right, which is very different than the populism on the left. The populism on the right feels a bit more, well, certainly conservative. It feels more, I don't want to be too hyperbolic in saying this, but a bit more fascist, a little less democratic. And on the left-hand side, it's very much socialist, but not socialist in the Mother Russia socialist in that true socialism of democratic socialism of the Nordic states in particular, where the economy and the social welfare of the people work hand in hand. And that's where this younger population, I think, is certainly plugging in. You're already starting to see it in how they're unionizing. The union movement was essentially nascent since the 1970s, early 80s, and it's now coming back in force. It's because these young people in particular really believe in social good, social welfare, social justice, and they're willing to band together to make these changes, to get the salaries they want, the benefits they want, make sure that their voices are heard. But yes, this is a generational shift with them. It's big, and I don't think folks are taking it seriously enough.
So let's try to take this globally now, because many Western countries have either local or national elections in the coming year or two. Certainly, large countries like India have elections coming up. Mexico, our southern neighbor in the U.S., has elections coming up. Is this dynamic that you mentioned earlier about urban rural, is this true globally? Are we seeing political divides like this practically everywhere?
Yeah, we absolutely are. I mean, turn on the news, go onto YouTube today if you're listening to this, and Google the French protests around farmers right now. Like, the farmers have marched into every major city in France, including the capital, Paris, bringing with them bales of hay, garbage, and manure. And they've sprayed manure on some of the finest looking government buildings in the land, in protest to the way the government is engaging with them as rural people. So this is happening in other places too. There's a divide that exists. The rural urban divide has always been there, mind you. It's just now it feels bigger. There was a time when farms were close to cities. Now farms are far from cities. There was a time when was better income inequality between farmers and people who are living and working in the city. That's broken down. So it is maybe not universal, but it is something that we're seeing in more and more nations now, this rift between those people that are living in the cities and those that are not.
That was sort of what underpinned Brexit, wasn't it? That issue sort of, it wasn't the only issue in that election, but when the United Kingdom chose to leave the European Union, it felt like it was the rural communities, the farming communities, those who had some commodity that they were trying to trade that drove a lot of the momentum behind that. So I guess this isn't new, but it's
No,
manifesting in different ways.
no, none of this is new. I mean, the rift between farmers and and the cities has been around as long as there's been recorded history. There's always been some rift there. The value systems are slightly different. The economic systems are slightly different. The social structure is wildly different today. Um, yeah, they're there. It's how we deal with it now that will decide whether we move in a progressive direction or we reverse. I don't know where we're headed on that front. We're in a period right now of a lot of a risk, quite frankly. I don't think that the world has had this many challenges line up in the same way since about 1936. And we all know what happened shortly after that. The difference between, that period of, like, let's say, the First World War, through the Great Depression, through the 1918 pandemic, also known as the Spanish flu, and into the Second World War, is that happened over like a 20-year period, right? 20 or 30-year period. What we're dealing with now is essentially a compressed version of that, where all of this stuff has essentially happened in 4 years. That's why it's feeling like this overdue pressure on us to figure out what's going on. In fact, it's such a great pressure that just a few weeks ago, I launched a new newsletter called New Rules with my partner, Marcia Stepanek. And you can read it at newrulesmedia.substack.com. And we're trying to help people make sense of this noise right now that's out there, because if you only fixate on the problems, you're not going to get to the solutions. But it is challenging now for sure. And there is a growth in authoritarianism worldwide that's similar to what the lead up to World War II experienced. But what we didn't have in that period, and what makes this current time period that we're in super novel, is that the media landscape has really changed. And disinformation, the use of AI, deep fakes, etc., just continues to grow. And that will impact how people perceive the world. If you're a highly critical person, I dare I say highly educated, you're looking for deep fakes. You're constantly questioning the information that comes across your eyes that doesn't come from one of the major news sources like the New York Times or CBS News or even CNN. You're constantly thinking, if it's not these organizations that are, for the most part, trusted, vetted, etc. The AP is probably the most centrist of any news source. You're constantly asking, where did it come from? Who's the perspective? How is it being delivered to me? But if you're not, and you let your confirmation bias slip in, which is what a lot of people do, you might get news from a source that's not really news, that is pushing disinformation, and you say, see, that's exactly what I thought. That's exactly what I thought. It's confirmation bias. And that confirmation bias is typically leveraged by some pretty unsavory characters in their grab for power.
One other topic on global politics. It seems also that this is not new, but we're seeing it more now, is trying to use ethnic or racial divides within a country to divide the electorate. Again, not novel, not new, but it seems to
Playbook.
be, yeah, it seems to be being done more nakedly. Not even trying, saying the quiet part out loud, as the kids say.
Yeah.
And this has been true here in the U.S. I think, unfortunately, the migrant crisis has really exposed that in our politics. But I think it's been true in other countries, other parts of the world, where there are ethnic, racial, religious divides, and there's political movements that try to exploit that and basically say, hey, vote for me because the other guy doesn't like us. And since we all don't like the other guy, right? Now, do you believe that as we have a new generation coming into the electorate, that they are less prone to that kind of divide because of their more global view of the world? Or is the new generation just as susceptible as any past generation, and they're going to fall into the same traps?
Everyone's susceptible. And you can take a look at Gen Z and just say, WTF, because they are the most diverse generation that we've ever had in this country from a racial, ethnic, religious perspective, even non religious people in that group. And it's interesting who they pick to support and who they don't, who they demonize and who they don't. They're all about the immigrant, they're all about people of color, but they've really turned away from Jews in the past few months. So it kind of goes both ways. Like, there is a tendency for us to demonize people that we don't really know or don't really trust. And it is a classic tactic of authoritarian leaders to do this. And, um, I would say the Republican Party in particular here, but I would say conservative parties worldwide have really leaned into demonizing groups, othering groups, primarily immigrant groups, and saying, "Look, they're taking your jobs, they're destroying our country, they're essentially eroding the fabric away of our nation. They're coming for you." It's fear tactics and fear mongering. And we know historically it doesn't end well. It doesn't end well. It incites to violence, possible war in some cases, but it is highly problematic. Um, it's interesting with the current debate around immigrants in this country, if I can just share, the diversity of the immigrants coming in is quite impressive. And I think at first it was easy for conservatives to say they're coming from Latin America, a place that the United States has always had a mixed relationship with. And now the border crossings are people from across Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. They're from China, from Africa. I think it's harder to get that to stick, because the immigrants are just as diverse as our nation is.
Let's turn our attention to our workplaces for a
Hmm.
moment. We've got a lot of listeners to this program who are business leaders, nonprofits or for profits, community leaders, and the like. And they are increasingly dealing with a workforce that is as multi generational as it gets, from people who have been in the workforce for 40 or 45 years and have a breadth and depth of experience and a certain worldview, to the newest hires out of college, 21, 22 years old, and expect something completely different from their employers as well as their employers' voice on big issues, societal and otherwise. What is some advice that you have for leaders who are trying to navigate this environment and create a corporate culture that is welcoming of every age group and every background, when increasingly that feels like we have a society trying to pull those folks apart?
Yeah, people love to play the generations against one another. It's kind of like fun, I think, for folks to try to figure out what separates us and not focus on what unites us. It's counterproductive. We have the most generationally diverse workplace, probably in the history of the country, in place right now that will continue to grow. It's continuing to grow because there is a high demand for labor, a shortage of labor, and a very hot economy. So, what has happened is two things. Longevity is extended significantly in this country. So, we're seeing a lot more people live into older age, that's post 65, in good health. We're also seeing at the same time a long term trend of decreasing birth rates. And these decreasing birth rates have turned up as a smaller workforce. So, just to give you a sense, there were 76 million boomers at their peak. There are only 69 million Gen Z at their peak. Because of the economy, because of the pandemic and the economy, a lot more boomers than were expected exited the workforce. So that's kind of hypercharged the tightness of the labor market. So if businesses aren't considering older adults as part of their labor strategy, they're missing the future right now, because that is the future. They are the last great available pool of talent that we have here, them and immigrants. Technology will play a role too. But if you're building out an enterprise that really is truly, as my colleague Megan Gerhardt says, gentelligent, really understands the generations, you have to start by listening to the people that are within your workforce. You have to start hearing what they're saying and activating on it, whether that's the design of the workplace itself, how you're constructing benefits, or how you're building your teams. You also have to make sure that you're hiring in the right way. You know, we've never had to hire for older adults before, certainly not in our lifetimes. We've hired for young people, we've hired for mid-career people. We've never hired for older adults before. Certainly not in my lifetime. I don't expect you did either, Brian. And I would imagine most people on this, listening to this today, haven't either. So it's a shift in mindset too. And we have to consider one thing, I think, probably center to all of this is that if you've met one worker, you've met one worker. So you can't assume that either people aren't willing to do a job or up to the task or underskilled or overqualified. My favorite way that businesses try to nudge out older workers, they're overqualified. We have to look through the lens of what the person can actually do and what they have done and how they can contribute to the enterprise writ large to meet the future realities of the economy. Because if our labor market has changed, guess what's also changed? Our consumer markets. They've changed overnight. The youth market, I hate to tell the big consumer groups in this country, but the youth market is shrinking. It's shrinking, and it's shrinking fast. The fastest growing demographic in this country right now is those people over 85, followed by those people over 100, followed by those people over 65. The fastest growing labor market in this country are people over 75, followed by those under 65. The 16 to 24s are actually decreasing. Like, I can't hammer this home enough for businesses right now. You've got to get on board with making your businesses, both on the labor side and the consumer side, age inclusive if you want to expand your market share. If you're fine with your market share shrinking, stay on course. Stay on course. Do whatever you're doing. If you're tech, stay what you're doing. Like, pay no attention to nobody else. But if you're really interested in growing your market, you have to think about the fact that a brand new one is here.
Now, one of the tactics that is probably the oldest way of reducing your costs has been the idea of fewer experienced workers. Let's bring in the new college grad. We'll pay them half. They'll be happy to have the job, and we'll be able to get away with a marginal, roster of salaries here. And whatever we're losing in the experience, we'll make up for in training. It certainly feels like that we're at the end of the line for that, both
It's
because of
done.
the shortage, the
It's
shortage of
done.
the young worker. But
Yeah.
let's talk about your recommendation, though. You have to get better at hiring the more experienced and older talent. But that's a fundamentally different recruiting
It sure is.
methodology. I mean, that changes
But here,
everything about your process.
but wait. I'm not suggesting that you go recruiting for these folks. I'm suggesting you try to keep them, because you already have these folks working in your enterprises right now. Many of them might want to stay post 65 or post 70, but they might not necessarily love the way their job is set up or where they're working within the enterprise. And guess what? the math changes after 65. You're not as concerned about healthcare anymore because the government covers that. You're more concerned about having, we call this life stage benefits, making sure that an organization is set up for life stages. So that if you're 65, I'm just throwing that number out there. Please don't hit me for this, folks who are for pro-aging advocates. If you're 65 and you're thinking about retiring, if your business comes to you and says, you know what, Bob, we really like the work that you're doing. Would you consider going half-time? And they give Bob a flexible work option, Bob might be interested in that. But Bob may no longer want to work a full-time job. So to get to your point, Brian, older workers tend to be better in terms of their efficiencies. They know how to do their jobs. Younger people, not as efficient. Older people, more efficient because they understand how the job is done. So you can make the argument, okay, we can get that 20-something for half the price, but they're going to take twice as long to do it. Meanwhile, an older employee like Bob might actually know how to do it in less time. So going half time, half salary for somebody like that might actually be a good deal. But life stage benefits, life stage approach to work really becomes central in the approach for businesses going forward, because we are in fact moving away from a recruitment centered environment to a retention centered environment. So I don't know about you. My grandfather worked for the same company his entire life. Like the second he got out of the war, he went to work for Westinghouse. He spent 40 years there, retired with a Westinghouse pension. Are we going back to a 40-year career within one company? Not quite yet. But could we be inching in that direction? Yes, absolutely. Because it is really expensive to recruit people in a tight labor market. Like really, really expensive. So if I can figure out a way to retain my best people, it's better for my bottom line. It might require a little bit more work to get the systems up and running, but on the whole, it's better for me as an organization. What you're going to see businesses also do very quickly is they're going to move away from hiring from a specific skill almost overnight because specific skills become redundant too quickly. If you're a coder now, your job is not as important as it was because the machines can code. But if you can hire somebody who's a skilled communicator, who has the ability to work across the enterprise, hire somebody that's really curious and creative, I think those people that have strong liberal arts backgrounds are really poised for greatness in this new period. They're the ones that are really going to shine because they can move across things and they can learn. They're active, engaged learners. So these are the folks that, might go back for another degree, but even if they're not going back for another degree, they're leveraging the other tools that they have to learn. Now, that can be in office trainings. Look for those people. Who's going to those trainings? They're active learners. Are people utilizing YouTube, the platform everybody's on, to learn new skills? Are they going back for certifications? Like these are the people you want to really latch yourself into because they're the ones who are willing to stay and are willing to make investments in themselves.
Let's take a moment because I know you wrote an article on this about as we talk about demographic groups in the workplace, women in particular. And I know you wrote
Mhm.
an article around women, I think, going through or post menopause. Is
Going
that right?
going into menopause, this is menopause is something that affects more than half of the population. Yet, at least up until 2022, only 15% of organizations had some type of benefit or policy around menopause in the workplace. This is a perfect example of this. When people don't have the supports they need within their workplaces, they leave their workplaces. So, businesses in this country are very quickly coming to the realization that midlife career women who bring with them incredible expertise and creativity and problem solving abilities, highly resilient, um, they were starting to leave. They were starting to leave the workforce because the jobs were not set up, the benefits were not set up to help them, in part, navigate this natural transition. And really, I mean, it seems like overnight now businesses have gotten on board. And yes, it is only 15%. It probably jumped significantly in 2023, but I think it'll be normal across enterprises going forward because midlife women in particular are a talent pool that people want. And I also think if you're a pragmatic HR manager or CHRO or COO, You're taking a look at the pipeline of talent right now, and you're getting more women that are highly educated coming into businesses now. And you're going to want them to stay and feel valued and make sure that they're part of the whole. And, when surveyed across all women, all economic groups, two-thirds of women believe there should be some type of menopause benefit within their workplace. So there's a disconnect here right now. If only 15% are offering it and two-thirds of women want it, there's a pretty big gap to fill here. I always say for businesses, and this goes across the board when it comes to managing their people, it's not so much about managing, it's working with, meeting your employees where they are. The surveys that are done, they're lipstick on a pig. Actually have conversations with your workers. Like, what are your pain points? What is really keeping you up at night? And then work to help solve some of those issues now, so you can retain these people in the future. And Brian, these things don't always have to cost a lot of money. I mean, I think businesses hear these as new things and they're going to cost a ton of money and they don't have that money to spend because they've got to get the profits to the shareholders and yada, yada, yada. But just ask them. Just ask them what they really need and see if you can meet them there. If you can't, okay, you can't, but ask them. And we've seen with businesses that have done this, at least their first go of it can be a little messy, but their first go of it on any issue as it relates to inclusivity in the workplace at least signals to their workers that they're on board. They're trying their best. They're working to build a more inclusive enterprise, and that builds trust. Because as we move to a retention model, the place of employment is going to be more of a partner, just like it was in the 1950s. My grandfather had all of his, maybe not all of his wealth, but a good majority of his wealth tied up in the corporate pension. He lived a very comfortable retirement as a result of that.
I'm curious too. I've also heard a lot of feedback from those who are approaching retirement, whether they own their own company or they're senior executives within a larger publicly traded organization or privately held company. They're concerned that they don't have an obvious successor to their role or an
Yes.
obvious person to step into their seat if they lead the company. And it
Yes.
feels, again, this is anecdotal for me. But from what we've talked about and just from your research, it certainly feels like this is a big problem. And this could be a significant societal level problem if businesses literally don't have a meaningful succession plan. What are your thoughts on this, and how can people in that position, maybe they're 3 or 4 years away from their planned retirement,
Yeah.
start getting that succession planning in a place that can leave them confident the business will carry on beyond their time there?
So there's two sides to this, right? There's the small business owners or the business owner side of this, and then there's the people that are within companies that are kind of larger companies like publicly traded.
Hmm.
The the small and medium enterprises, the SMEs, they're primarily owned by older adults right now. Most of these businesses are profitable. In large parts of the country, there is no one to transfer this business to right now. So this is something I want everybody to hear loud and clear. There's a huge business opportunity right now for younger people who may want to own a business in this country, both middle-aged and younger people who want to own a business in this country, because there are older adults that are looking to sell these profitable businesses right now. They don't have a succession plan in place. Their children don't want the business. They can't find a good person to buy the business from. These businesses are everywhere right now. Within bigger corporations, there needs to be a bit more of a delicate walk, because you have to make sure you avoid age discrimination laws in planning for this. But succession planning really should be at the forefront of every organization, regardless of the level of employee. Like, it's something that you should be considering. So it's okay to have conversations with your employees about what their plans are for the future. Like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Where do you see yourself in 10 years? We should not be afraid to have these conversations with our older employees either. So, if I have a conversation with an employee who's, approaching retirement age at 60, what is considered to be a normal retirement age between 60 and 65, and I say, what are your plans? And he says, I plan to be here until I'm 70. Well, I need to work from that reality. Like, if I like the employee and I feel like he's going to be good for me. But if he says, Brad, I'm out at 65, then I immediately should move to planning for his successor, like finding a way to build that knowledge that he's had, presumably for an average tenure that's much longer than younger employees, to transfer that knowledge down. And that can be done through shadowing, that can be done through and mentorship, that can be done through, the basics, uploading content, understanding like what the person does, how they've done their job, making sure that a CRM tool is used. I mean, it requires some creativity, but right now, and I think for 20, 30 years at least, maybe 40 years, the default was, okay, bye. And people walked out the door. We just don't have that luxury anymore. And that knowledge transfer from the older, presumably more senior person to the person that might be filling their shoes is really, really an essential component to success.
So last topic I want to touch on is media consumption. Now we could literally spend an entire podcast just talking about this, but I think let's
Days,
do it in the
days.
context in the context of what we covered today. We covered politics today, we covered business. So I'll think about this mostly from advertising and marketing. There was a time where you could buy a 60-second ad and tens of millions of people in your country could see it at the same time because we all watch the same television programs. Or in an earlier era, radio served a similar function, newspaper served a similar function. We now have as much fragmentation as you've ever had in media, which is wonderful for the consumer. Pick your own adventure, choose to watch what you want, when you want, how you want, read what you want, when you want. But it feels like it's getting very, very difficult to reach a mass market at any given time. Politicians are faced with this when they're campaigning, businesses are faced with this trying to reach their product to their target audience. What are you seeing in that landscape that is either concerning to you or hopeful for you about how the generations are consuming media and how those who'd like to reach them from an advertising perspective are either able to do that better, or is it getting harder to reach your audience and it's causing different challenges for businesses and individuals?
I think it is. It is challenging. I mean, this is a very hyper fractured media environment right now. Anybody can be a reporter. Anybody can have their own channel these days, and there are no guardrails on that. We've moved away from the big three broadcast networks to multiple news networks, some of whom deliver 24 hours a day. And then, of course, everything that you can find online. A reporter gets booted from a major network. They just start their own channel. That's kind of what's happened now. And sometimes they take their sponsors with them. Now, where are the upsides on this? Well, I do think that there are clear and present pathways for independent journalists now that weren't there before. I certainly think a platform like Substack offers that opportunity for people to do independent journalism. I certainly think podcasting has really opened the door for independent journalism. There are also platforms now that are working to get advertisers placed on the right platforms. So rather than going to CBS and saying, CBS, I want to buy a 30-second commercial because I know that your viewers watching the nightly news are within this demographic, um, businesses have to be a bit more targeted, and their spending needs to be spread out a bit more. It's not $7 million for a Super Bowl commercial. It might be, $1 million spread over, a couple hundred different communication platforms and programs. Um, does it get any easier in the short term? No. Where are the big winners here? I think we're going to see consolidation in the internet space pretty quickly. I'm not sure what that fully looks like yet, but um, if the internet moves to a public utility, I think we'll see that there'll be a few companies that end up on top, and they'll have news services, and they'll be able to communicate those out. Could be Google, could be YouTube, could be Meta, that are the last three standing, just like CBS, NBC, and ABC. But how do you really get to the customer? Well, there's no such thing as real broadcast anymore. The only thing that really works are these seminal events, and they are really expensive, and they box people out from getting to the audience because of the price point. The Super Bowl is one of those events. 28 million people watched this year, 129, the biggest audience ever. The Olympics are another. The World Cup is another. The World Series is another that really pull in big audiences. Those still work. But I think we're going to start to see businesses really targeting their customers, finding who is the most likely person to purchase their goods. And that is difficult under the current way of business because we age segment. And guess where we stop age segmenting? 65. Even the big companies, again, YouTube, Google, Meta, like they only count up to 65 really. So they're not even doing age segmentation correctly. What artificial intelligence may do for advertisers is it may give them a better sense of who the end customer is. Like it might be learning at some point who Brad Sherman is, who Brian Matos is, so that rather than coming at you through one specific channel, they're getting you on the channels that you're actually on. It's not broadcast, it's targeted. Or you could call it maybe targeted broadcast, where they're going after all of the Brian Matoses of the world, all of the Bradley Shermans of the world. And that may actually end up being a lot more cost effective because they know who their customer is.
We may have to bring you back to talk more about this topic, especially as we start to see that media consolidation, and maybe as we get deeper into our elections this year and see how it feels like every 4 years politicians adapt to that landscape because they have an enormous amount of money to experiment, and they always discover something that works.
They always find it. And, there are certainly, I will say this, there are certainly media organizations that have really done a pretty phenomenal job of adapting to the world now. They stumbled for a few years, especially the print newspapers. But I think if you take a look at the New York Times right now, it's a fully digital media organization that has a newspaper. The Wall Street Journal is the same, and they're delivering on their promise of good news, good content. And because of that, because of their large readership, are still really I almost call it a broadcast. Certainly a wide net can be cast for their advertisers as a result. But that's about it. Not that many people watch the nightly news anymore like they used to.
Yes. So we will post this conversation with a link to the book that we promoted last time you were here, The Super Age, Decoding Our Demographic Destiny. Anything else that you'd like our listeners to know about how to reach you, or any other products and services that you've got out there today?
Yeah, you can reach out to me at behumanchange.com. That's our new corporate name. Of course, feel free to grab the book if you haven't already and want to understand what our demographic future looks like. And also, if you're confused about this period that we're going through right now, because it is a disruptive one, check out newrulesmedia.substack.com, which will give you a sense of what the future is and what's coming, and more importantly, how to navigate it.
Excellent. We will include those links in the description of this show. We'll put it on the blog for this site as well. And when we have the YouTube clips, we'll include them in the descriptions there. Bradley,
Super.
thank you again for spending time with us and talking us through this wonderful and evolving world.
Thanks, Brian. Good to be with you.
So I promised going into that interview I was going to share a personal take on one of those topics that was discussed. And I just wanted to take a moment to talk about the media consumption part of that conversation, because I don't think we fully appreciate or understand where we are, exactly where we're going as demographics change on this. What we know is that not only do the younger demographic consume media in fundamentally different ways than their parents or grandparents did. I think that's a given to many who listen to this program. The fact that this podcast exists is evidence of that. Nobody listened to podcasts 25 years ago. They didn't exist, and nobody would have listened to them if they did. But it's not just about how they're consuming that information. It's not just about being on your social media feeds or watching videos instead of reading articles, or looking at influencers instead of looking at trusted people on television. It is that young people are getting flooded with more information every hour of every day than anybody ever has in their entire life. And it's hard enough if you've lived a pretty full life and perhaps you're in your 50s or 60s and you're consuming all this information and you have a whole lifetime of experience through which to filter that information. You kind of have a good radar about what's legitimate and what's BS and who's trying to just sell you something and who's an honest broker. But imagine being 21 years old. Imagine being 24 years old. Imagine still going through your maturing process, still learning the fundamentals of life, still trying to pull your life together, figure out where you fit into this great big world. And every day, because of the access that you have to mass media, you hear from literally hundreds of voices. You consume dozens and dozens of articles and stories. Some are news, some are celebrity content, some is just stuff in people's personal lives, and some things are total BS. And at least a percentage of that's completely made up. And your 22 or 23 or 24-year-old mind has to try somehow, some way to filter all of this through whatever lived experiences that you've had to make sense of what's worth keeping and taking into consideration and what to throw out, and which voices are to be trusted and which ones are there to manipulate you or to potentially do harm to you. We've never had a generation that was growing up at a time when they were completely bombarded with so much information from so many sources trying to pull them in so many different directions. We don't really know where that takes us. And I have a lot of trust and a lot of faith in our younger generation to mature fast enough to take in that information and make heads or tails of it. Because not only do they have access to it, but I think their brains are just working faster than a lot of ours did when we were in our younger years. But it's fascinating that not only do younger generations consume media in fundamentally different formats, but they consume so much more of it than people who are 30 or 40 years their elder. When you talk to people, including many of my guests in their 50s and 60s, they don't use all the same forms of media that younger people use, but they also don't take in nearly as much information. They kind of know that there's only some information that they really need to make decisions about their life or to stay informed. And they're more, it seems to me, able to shut off the phone, shut off the television, shut off social media, and move on and go apply what they've learned in their life because they have so much experience already. So I'm not sure where that takes us, but I think it's important that we consider that there's not just a difference in how people are consuming media, but there is a fundamental difference in how much information people are being flooded with every single hour of every single day. And I hope that this program can break from some of that. The whole concept of this show is not to throw a ton of information at you every day. I don't want to be in your inbox every day. I want to be part of your life at least once a week, maybe much the way that your friends are. I hope that about once a week you come to the program, you download the latest episode, maybe you go back and listen to a past episode, you take in some of that information, you go and make some thought processes and decisions with it, maybe you talk about it with people, and then you might not hear from me again for a week, and that's fine for me. I don't think it would be healthy for you to hear from me every single day. I don't think it'd be healthy for me to be in your inbox every single day. And I don't think it's a good way to break through. I think it's about quality, not quantity. So, with that in mind, I hope that this show for you, whatever age you are, is filling an important part of your week, an important part of your month, an important part of your life, but that we are helping break through some of that noise and helping to synthesize the information so that you don't have to consume 100 data points. You can consume one comprehensive interview. And I am working hard to be a trusted voice for you so that you don't have to do every piece of homework on your own. I can help you do some of it and bring the facts because I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm just here to help bring experts to share information that help you to make the best decisions that you can with the information we can help provide. Now, let me end on a positive note because one of the important things about our world is that we do have more ways to connect than we've ever had before. And I believe this is going to ultimately be a big positive. We talked in previous episodes about the trend of loneliness. And this is generally true as people get older. Perhaps their spouse passes away, their kids move out, society puts them to the side. We talked about in this episode how many companies just throw away people who are over the age of 50, stupidly, by the way. And this leads to social isolation. I am optimistic that our new era of mass media allows people to stay connected in healthy ways and allows the digital world to create more of a real world experience where you stay connected through digital means, but you keep those connections in personal ways. And I do think that a younger generation, while all the evidence has shown they're spending too much time in digital devices and they're losing some of the social cohesion, I'm optimistic that they recognize that and they're working to address it and they're coming together in person in ways that we haven't seen before. And I think there may very well be a renaissance just around the corner that allows the digital world to blend with the real world so that we can get the benefits of both. So these are some trends that I'm watching for, and hopefully it gives you a little better insight into how I'm formatting this program and how I'm thinking about how we can help, how this program can cut through some of the noise, reach everybody regardless of their background, and maybe when you were listening to this show, put aside the differences of demographics. We have to respect that our audiences consume media in different ways and reach them where they are. We have to respect that people will have different perspectives on the news. But I would much rather have an environment and a situation where people look to this program as different than everything else they see in their feed and every other source of information they have. And whether you're in your 60s or you're in your 20s, whether you're a high school kid who's just curious about the world that's changing around you, or somebody in their 80s who just wants to know what the world's going to be like for their grandkids, I hope you can all share this together. I hope this podcast becomes an experience that parents, kids, grandparents, that multi generations can listen to and talk about and share, and that this becomes an area of community and not an area of division. And if we can use media and our changing demographics for that purpose, then we'll have done some real good in this world. If you'd like to join our community of curious minds, it's easy to do so. Subscribe to the podcast anywhere you get your podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, the Odyssey app, or truly any other form of podcast that you receive. Find our clips on YouTube. We're also going to start making full episodes available, select full episodes available on our YouTube channel. You can find me there. I'm on all of our social media channels, and if you need to find those links or learn more about me, just find my website. It's brianjmatos.com. That's brianjmatos.com. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Look forward to talking to you again soon, and I hope that you will all stay curious.